Hello and welcome to another edition of the Utility Week podcast. My name's James Wallin. I am the Editor-in-Chief of Utility Week, and I'm delighted to welcome onto the podcast with me this week, me. Well, specifically, me a month earlier. So we're going to hear another session from Utility Week Live. The last week we had a session with Mark Thurston of Anglian Water and a regulation panel talking about all things water. This week we're going to be focusing on energy, and we're going to be bringing you a session that was titled Reimagining the Energy System for Clean Power 2030 and Beyond. We went into lots of different interesting areas in this discussion. We started off by talking about what was then a very recent government review of Ofgem's strategic priorities. We talked about the trade-offs, potential trade-offs inherent in that. We then focused a little bit on central planning in energy, and specifically on the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, which the National Energy System Operator has been tasked with preparing, and is really central to a lot of the plans around decarbonisation going forward. We talked about the challenge on the demand side for reaching Clean Power 2030. And we finished off by touching on one of the hot topics in energy at the moment, the impact of data centres connecting to the grid. So, wide-ranging conversation, but a really, really interesting one. And I was delighted to welcome onto the panel Juliet Davenport, somebody who will be familiar to readers of Utility Week. She wears lots of hats, probably best known as the founder of the energy retailer Good Energy, currently a Clean Power 2030 Commissioner, and also on the board of the Crown Estate. From Cadent Gas, we had Tony Ballance, their Chief Strategy and Regulation Officer. We also had Sonia Brown, Group Head of Strategy at National Grid, and Anthony Ainsworth, who is the Chief Operating Officer, INC, for E.ON. So really, really great panel. You can hear them in order. I started off by reflecting on a session which had preceded this panel, where at the start of the day, on the first day of Utility Week Live back in May, we had a standing room only session, as this was standing room only, I should say. But we kicked off with Richard Tice, the energy spokesman and deputy leader of Reform, talking about his views on utilities and net zero. I'd put to Richard the three strategic objectives that government had set for Ofgem. That being the current objective, which is to protect current and future customers, adding on to contribute to net zero and to contribute to wider growth in the UK. I asked him for his opinion on those priorities. As you would imagine, he took umbrage with one in particular, net zero. But I asked the same question to our panel, and you're about to hear, starting with Juliet Davenport, what they thought. I'll be back at the end of the podcast just with a few more messages.
I think it's a really interesting time to actually see this review for Ofgem. I set up an energy company in 1999, I think it was, and battled against the regulation that basically was very focused on an economic regulator looking at today's customer, so not thinking about the future, not system thinking at all. So personally, I welcome the embracing of a kind of wider remit for Ofgem. I think in terms of what we're looking at, the kind of the growth and the net zero, I would slightly change it personally, but moving in the same direction. So I would definitely look more at a resilience point, because I think we need to look at energy resilience within the UK. And for me, that's both environmental resilience, but also security resilience. And quite often, I've seen them go hand in hand. I don't think you need to have one or the other. They actually move forward in the same direction. And this is, for me, this is what's quite exciting now, because the regulation has it's definitely lagged what we're seeing here. So I can't remember last time I came to Utility Week. It was a while ago. I definitely got lost at neck then as well. But the shift in terms of the people who are here is massive. You walk in and there's flexibility discussion as soon as you walk through the door. And that is the reality of what we're moving into today. We have a flexibility capability now in this country that didn't exist 20 years ago. But I don't think the regulation has stayed pace with it. And I definitely don't think consumer protection has stayed pace with it. So I would kind of like to see the consumer protection dialed up in a flexibility context and think about long-term resilience, both environmental and security.
Thank you. Juliet. Tony.
Yeah, I mean, it is very good to see the review of Ofgem come out. It's good to see a recognition of the need to simplify and streamline the duties. I think it's never helped regulators to say, we want you to protect consumers, ensure investors get a return, resilience, sustainability, net zero, and. And we of course see that across sectors where we have a multitude of objectives. I think my personal view is less is more. I think if you streamlined it further, you could say, what are regulators there to do? They're to protect today's and future customers. The original duties that regulators had were much more in line with that. That's not to say net zero and growth are not important, but if you are protecting consumers in the longer term, then by definition, you will be seeking to achieve those longer term objectives. So I'm not in the game of saying we need to get rid of a net zero duty. Of course, decarbonising the economy is super important, is one of the priorities, and I can see why a government want to have that nudge on Ofgem, and also growth is incredibly important. Without growth, then we're not really going to achieve much of what we need to do. But I would argue that growth comes from a regulator doing its day job really well, which is about today's and future consumers.
Thank you, Tony. Sonia?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I really agree with some of the points that both Juliet and Tony have made. I think that for me, having spent 9 years at Ofgem in an earlier part of my career, the clarity of knowing exactly what your job is very important in actually being able to execute it very well. And so having a long list or a laundry list of 27 things that you have to think about is really tough if you're actually sitting in the regulator's office, and there are going to then be trade-offs and difficulties. I think that, I really agree as well that resilience is exceptionally important to customers, but I see that as part of what matters to customers. And if you were to develop a system that was great at lots of things, but didn't actually deliver resilience, then I think you would be failing what matters for customers, both in the short and actually in the long term. I think that for me, what's really very important as we look at this is how do we find opportunities for areas to actually mutually reinforce these types of objectives and encourage the regulator towards thinking about those types of opportunities. So a really good example of this is how do we get more large loads as customers connected to the system, which helps to lower the cost, because it's a fixed cost system, to end users, and that can also help with making sure that we can get more green energy on the system faster through clever siting and location of those sites. So I'm really looking for those win-win-win opportunities when I'm thinking about this. And then the final thing that I would just like to say is that we are in the middle of a technology revolution. It is essential that Ofgem really thinks about that in absolutely everything that they are doing, whether that is how they are regulating or what they are regulating. We all need to be thinking about how to embed that thinking in everything that we're effectively delivering now.
Thank you. Anthony?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So we broadly welcome the three aims of Ofgem as well. So current and future customers, growth and net zero. And the devil will be in the detail of the balance between those and how they're implemented through the strategy and policy statement that's to follow. And what we'd like to see more coming through is about affordability and then sustainability and the flexibility which we've touched on. And I would, if you pick up Richard Tice's words about politics and democracy is about challenging different views, then I would challenge what he said. And I think the net zero part of that is incredibly important, because it's not just about national wealth, it's also about national health as well. And that's why an affordable system and the relative cost of energy, whether it's for consumers or businesses, is super critical to get right.
Just sticking on those those objectives for Ofgem for a moment, because I think it frames the discussion really well. Where do you think that, because we've got Tim Jarvis, the interim CEO of Ofgem, speaking tomorrow. So when he's looking at those potential 3 objectives, where do you think the biggest potential trade-offs are going to be? What's he going to have to balance off with those 3 objectives? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to go.
If I kick off, I mean, I think one of the things that we're going to have to think about is how the regulation evolves. So today you've got a supplier hub approach. That's the way we've thought about the energy system. In a flexibility system, potentially you have multiple more players. And that becomes much more complicated when you start to think about something like the Balancing and Settlement Code, which only allows members to change it or challenge it. And so potentially you have an asymmetric system embedded in our energy regulation that is kind of slightly unseen. And my question is Ofgem going to kind of try and think about how they might make sure things like the Balancing and Settlement Code, some of the other codes, are more representative of what a future market might look like? My concern, and the reason I bring it up, is because I personally think there are fundamental economic inefficiencies within the regulation where it tries to contradict other pieces of regulation. And so that's where you always increase cost, and that then ends up in consumer bills.
Yeah, I think the key thing for a regulator, and Sonia touched on this, is not to create lots of trade-offs. So you're seeking to find a way where the customer is central to the decision making, rather than saying, well, that's good for growth, but not good for we shouldn't see a world where these things are mutually exclusive and there's big trade-offs. I think the net zero one is more contentious in some sense, because that talks about pace of delivery, but in some sense you have to regard that as a regulator as saying, well, that is the plan, so we need to stay consistent with that. So the decisions that I'm taking are ones of what's in the right customer interest whilst delivering net zero, and if it's good for the consumer, it should be good for growth. What we don't want is a world where, if we spend lots of money, that's good for growth, but it's not necessarily the right thing for the consumer. So I think it's looking for a world where we're trying to minimize those trade-offs. I mean, the other trade-off, of course, that's in there is the vexed issue of which Anthony introduced, the vexed issue of what customers are going to pay for. But in some sense, and we only have to look at the water sector, where both Sonia and I worked, to not realise that trade-off of saying we want to politicise the regulatory system of saying, well, you must minimise the price, because in some sense that's not the right thing to be doing. And of course, prices is important. That's what the regulator is there to do, is make sure that network industries deliver as efficiently as possible, whilst obviously ensuring that the long-term outcomes are being delivered.
And that's always the risk, isn't it? At times like this, especially when you have, in geopolitical tensions driving up prices, there's always that potential for a knee-jerk reaction from a government to say, right, the priority is bring down bills before the end of the Parliament. So, Sonia, your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that I think that for me it's just really important that customer needs to be thought of as both present and future, because otherwise you do end up with the risk of that form of short-termist thinking. I think that, we can all understand why affordability is such a really grave concern for households up and down the country at the moment. And I do think that means that there needs to be ongoing focus from all of us in making sure that everything that we're doing is as efficient as it possibly can be, and that we are leveraging as much technology as we can to do things better, differently, rather than trying to actually embed the system that has been there since, the 1960s. That is a very important transformation. But in the absence of actually progressing and moving forwards in some of these areas, We will be in a world where, bottlenecks actually add to cost rather than reducing costs. So we need to really focus on making sure that we're delivering investment at the right time, at the right place, at the right pace. And that's definitely what we're doing at National Grid.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on the affordability and the flexibility, because I think the potentially two sides of the same coin. So if affordability is really fundamental, both for national wealth and national health, then what is it that drives up the relative cost of our energy relative to Europe, say? Some of it is the energy mix, some of it is how the marginal price is set, but a lot of it is the policy costs and the costs of delivering net zero. And I would sort of challenge the period over which we're trying to recover the costs. It's like trying to pay off the mortgage of your house in 5 years rather than over 30 years. And if we spread the cost of that, then the benefit that the future generations will get from that, they should be bearing some of the cost rather than it being front-loaded. So I think if you looked at what makes up the bill and shifted some of those costs over the longer term, you would actually drive down the cost of it. And then similar to what Sonia was saying about investment and bottlenecks, that actually if you focus on creating the right policy environment for flexibility, then what you're doing is you're reducing peak demand, you're shifting peak demand, you're building storage into the system, whether that is at a household level or an industry level, then you can get the benefits from driving down the costs that way as well.
Thank you all. Right, moving off the DESNZ review and looking more broadly at this question that we have for the panel. So obviously we're going to need to have a lot more coordination. We're going to have to do a lot more strategic kind of system planning on the path to clean power 2030 and beyond to net zero. So where do we start from? What are the priorities on that? And how do you avoid what often seems to happen in the energy sector, which is you get paralysis of choice. In the face of having to do so many things, you end up doing nothing. So I'll open it up to anyone who wants to start. Go on, Sonia.
I think that the question of strategic planning is essential because you need to know where we're building to and what we're building in order to actually be able to deliver those benefits that we're actually talking about. But I wouldn't underestimate how challenging that is because you're needing to look at different things and decide, is this a real opportunity or is it not a real opportunity? Is it speculative? Has this person got a place in 7 different queues, or is this the only place in the only queue that effectively matters? You can't lock down generation without thinking about demand, because ultimately you definitely then end up with a sub-optimized system. So it's really important and really difficult, and we need to kind of acknowledge both of those things in order to be able to move forwards with it.
But just to add to that, I think it's great that we're actually going to do it, because previously we were stuck because we decided that wasn't the role of the regulator or of government to think about that central plan. One of my other roles is I'm a commissioner for the Crown Estate. And one of the things that shocked me was that when I first arrived, we had no map of where all the offshore wind resource was, which therefore creates you a problem in terms of, well, where's your grid going to go to bring that offshore wind onshore? And so I do think strategic planning is extremely important. It's never going to be perfect, but you're not going to move the wind resource out of the North Sea. You're not going to move the solar resource out of the south of the UK. Well, actually, solar's pretty much universal, but there are trends within that. And your weather systems may be changing, but they are forecastable. And so I think putting that hat on, plus potential demand. There are parts of demand that just won't move. People are not going to move their residential hubs in the UK in the next 10 years. So those are going to stay relatively static. There will be other large-scale energy demand that will shift. So I do think even though we can't do a perfect job, we can start to do a job that really hasn't been envisaged. And then it becomes very obvious where some of the key investments need to go.
Yeah, it's absolutely clear that we were in need and do need a plan, particularly with an energy system with so many interventions from government around what gets built where. So there's a need for that garnering of things into some central scenarios and plans, and the NESO has a hell of a job to do to try and pull that together, and I think they're making a pretty good fist of it. I think that the danger with long-term planning is that you go, well, that's the answer. We're going out to 2050. This is what we're going to do. And then not testing, well, what needs to be true for those things to happen? And I'm sure we're going to come on and talk about the future of the gas networks, but some of those long-term plans just assume things around consumers that you would have to put some real caveats around, is that actually going to happen? Because again, it goes back to planning. If we want to run a planned economy, are we prepared to go and tell people what it is we expect them and what they have to do? And the reality is, I suspect in a liberal democracy, we're not going to tell people what to do. So the plans have to have flex in them. We live in a world of radical uncertainty about what the ultimate outcome is. That is not to say you don't need a plan. You absolutely have to have a plan. You need to know where you're going. But the variability around that plan needs to be built in and factored in terms of what that means for day-to-day decisions that we're going to have to take.
I'll let Anthony speak, then I'll come back to that one because I think that's a really interesting point. But go on, Anthony.
I think any planning that's done has to be done at a system-wide energy system level. Otherwise, you have one faction against another, you have one department against another, and that can't work. We can't have squeezing the balloon where it goes down in one area and pops up another. So you need to have system-wide thinking in there. But you also need to think, well, where are the incentives in the system? Where are profits made? Are they made in the right places to encourage innovation and growth? Or does it sustain old behaviours? So I think something could be looked at there to drive innovation and drive more creativity, maybe a little bit more downstream.
So coming back on Tony's point there about this balance between having this plan that drives everything and allowing the market to a certain extent dictate where investment goes. So that is it's difficult for me to envisage how that's going to work in practice, how concrete that plan is going to be, and what NESO's role is going to be there. So I'm interested to get the rest of the panel's view on that, on how you strike that balance.
So I think for me, it's about having a plan, but then having a really good understanding of what the key assumptions are that actually underpin that, and then how much the plan changes if you effectively relax one of those assumptions, so that everybody then understands the degree of movement within the central case. So to give a very real and practical example, like the level at which we expect heat to become electrified is one of the things that you would expect there to be a plan associated with a central case, associated with how that will be rolled out. But then in the event that customers' preferences don't actually align with what those expectations are, you would want to know what the impact and what the variance is on the overall plan associated with that deliverability. And I think that's the degree of conversation that we need to have. It's not just about a path, it's about the sensitivity of that pathway to changing assumptions that actually really enables us to start planning, because then we all have a collective understanding of what the things are that matters the most.
But there are some fairly obvious pieces. I mean, I think maybe 15 years ago, we were pretty certain we were going to get constraints between Scotland and England with offshore wind. I mean, that was absolutely obvious. And the lack of plan has put us into the situation where we are today. So I think I completely agree. There are various parts of this assumptions, and I think heat is one of the big challenges, actually. Electrification of vehicles slightly seems to be a bit more predictable, but heat definitely is a big problem.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with both of the things you've said. There are certain things you can lock in. You need to bring power from the north to the south. we should be able to take those decisions. Sonia's picked on the one issue that I think is really difficult. And what you can't do is just keep having hockey sticks that get steeper and steeper, saying, well, we've said we need to decarbonise heat through this solution, so what do? Oh, we'll just make the forecast even steeper, because the reality kicks in at some point, saying, well, if that's not happening, well, where's the plan B, as it were, that says, well, if that's not going to be realised, what's the plan that morphs out of that one? So in any piece of strategy work, that's what you would do. You'd look at what are the key indicators, what are the levers, and you'd flex as you went along. And that's I think, the kind of almost the next evolution of planning, is to start with some big top-down plans, but really then start to make those plans adapt in the light of real circumstances and how things change. You can see some of that coming through now in terms of what NISO and others are saying the future role of the gas will be. But I expect those things will change as we go further and further down the track, and time will reveal just how quickly and how much progress we make against some of those big decisions, big things that we're assuming are going to happen.
I didn't think I was going to quote Mike Tyson, but I am about to. So everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So, but it doesn't mean that you don't start with a plan. But I completely agree with what everybody's saying there. You start with some plans, some clear assumptions, and then as real life gets in the way, you adjust those assumptions and have a good, honest conversation, a good narrative about it, so that you keep everybody on board with what the intent is. I think we can become too narrow-minded. If one thing doesn't work, we focus on that, there's a debate around it, and we lose sight of what we're really trying to get done.
And just on, there's lots of other things you want to discuss, but just sticking for a moment on this Strategic Spatial Energy Plan that NISO is producing. Do you have any concerns about that, what's going to happen to that plan once it goes through the political system? Because we, as I understand it, we're going to get 7 different pathways that NISO is going to produce. They're going to put that to the Secretary of State. Seems fairly obvious to me that what is going to happen is he's going to go, well, I'll have all the benefits and none of the negatives. Create pathway 8, which is a fudge of everything. Is that therefore an actual plan if we get to that point?
I mean, I think there will be some backbone in the middle of it that you can't throw away. So there will be commonalities between the different plans that will absolutely be there, whatever you try and do through the political process. And I think for me, I think we've all said it, a plan is a plan, but it needs to be agile. And that is exactly the place we're in. We're moving into an uncertainty. What comes out of the political sort of review of the NISO plan, you'll move forward. But even within that, you'll see some shifts. So actually, if we see something like time of day and flexibility, see real value come through, because Ofgem's decided to look at the balancing and settlement code on Basuos recharging, for an example, that might actually bring flexibility through better. You may see that accelerate. And so your plan is obviously changed because you've got better flexibility coming from the demand side immediately. So I think the point is to make a decision. And it's like, I mean, I work with lots of startup and growth businesses, and what you absolutely know is the budget that you set at the beginning of the year will probably be wrong within a month. And that is the world we're in. We are not in a certain world. We will need to have agility, but there will be key parts of it that will stay stable that we absolutely need to do and not be indecisive about.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the government has to take a decision, and that's the system working, where, you know, NISO's role is to look at all the available evidence, set that out, and at the end of the day, it's the democratically elected government that has to take some decisions. You might be right that might involve a fudge, but that's the system, that's the process working, and that's what we have to stick with, I think.
I agree. I guess my hope is that we see other examples where organisations forecast and put plans to government, like OBR being a really good example of that. And so what can we learn from how that works, what works well, what doesn't work so well? There has to be some governance around this that makes us have confidence in the credibility of it. And I'm confident that will be the case.
Too much fudge isn't good for you.
Is that another Mike Tyson quote?
No, that's mine. But I'd love to see some bold ambitions in there that are stuck with, and pull one out really, which is about flexibility again, which can drive down system cost, it can reduce investment in the networks that's required, but also can give direct consumer benefits in their households up to £200-300 a year. They could be better off if we drive flexibility much better. And I think it's untapped potential at the moment in the policy and system.
Well, let's stick with that point. I do want to come to questions from the audience in just a moment, but just sticking on that demand side point. So what more do you think utilities can do to make the case for the demand side to be given kind of equal attention to generation? It suffers, doesn't it, from one of those things? It's invisible. There's not a ribbon you can cut around flexibility, and therefore it doesn't get the focus. But it's perhaps the trickiest part of Clean Power 2030. So what more can we do to make the case for it? Go on, Anthony.
Yeah, so we've got lots of real examples of what we do at E.ON, whether it's in the tariffs and the products that we offer, but there are real proof points of real savings for customers of £200 to £300 a year. We need to talk much more about those, get those in front of ministers and policymakers so they see that you can actually reduce the cost of a customer's bill without actually having to change some of the system. There are things that are live now that can do that. So we can push much more of that, for example.
So I'm really excited about the demand side and generally what we can do with flexibility. Both at the domestic level, having seen a digitalisation journey in other industries and thinking about what the power that can actually bring into utilities, but also with real proof points starting to come through at the transmission level associated with flexibility. We've just done a trial with a company called Emerald AI, and it would be on the customer side where AI can be flexible in response to signals that we would send it, which would help us to be able to connect more AI. That's great for growth, it's great for affordability, and creates one of these virtuous cycles that I was talking about earlier in the presentation. We've also got another company which is called GridCare, which again, through looking at more flexibility on the transmission system in New York, we've managed to find 600 megawatts of additional capacity that can be allocated. These are really big and very profound in being able to really make a difference to customer bills.
Yeah, I think the demand side is hugely important and probably, like you say, James, is not really factored in sufficient. I mean, the key thing with all the demand side stuff, you've got to make it easy for consumers and customers to adopt new technology. I'll throw one into the mix as a gas network, is hybrid heating technology. So we all recognise that decarbonising heating is really hard, but by heck, we make it really difficult for a consumer to do it because you've got to go and make substantial changes to your home in order to get an electrified solution. So why aren't we promoting hybrid heating technologies where you get a smaller heat pump, you keep your gas boiler, you can build all of the flex in there that helps you with peak demand. The consumer gets a good experience because they have the heat pump heating their home for much of the year. They get their hot water from their gas boiler, and when it's really cold, the gas boiler kicks in and gives you additional heat. What does that also do? It radically reduces your carbon emissions, not to the same extent as having a heat pump, but the best is becoming the enemy of the good in the sense of searching for a solution that is making it very, very difficult for consumers to participate in delivering net zero.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also got to look at, and my view is flexibility is the key. We've got to look at flexibility in industrial consumers. We lost a load of flex because we increased the cost of metering. So we just need to look at what all these barriers are and get rid of them, to be honest, and encourage, because if you're running a business and your day-to-day work is not providing flexibility to the electricity system, then why would you do it unless somebody's going to make it A, easy, and B, cheap? So that's our first job to do. I think really then trying to do the same with domestic consumers. I work with a French electricity company looking at energy management systems in France for home generation. And that's all they do. So they don't have any customers that don't do energy management. And again, that's just about a focus on a technology, optimizing self-use. They do it in integration with solar, but now moving into other technologies. And in France, they have a lot of hot water heating from electrics. So you've got that management balance in there as well, which they can use as flexibility. So I think it really is just about looking at the individual's capability, whether it's an individual consumer or an industrial consumer, and making it super simple to get into this market, but also looking at the economic signals, as I said earlier.
Thank you. Right, let's have some sensible questions then from the audience. Right, one down here.
Just wanted to introduce an elephant into the room, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
Data centers. What is your current view on dealing with data centers and their capacity connections from both vectors? Could we have multi-vector solutions? But also, could they hoover up quite a lot of the requirements for flexibility in the system? Thanks.
Good question. Sonia, do you want to start with that? I know that's when you think about it.
I'm really happy to. I think that energy can either be a blocker or an enabler for economic growth, and it's really important to be an enabler for economic growth. So I think it's really critical that we find good solutions associated with how we serve data center customers. And I think that, we are already investing at pace to meet some of what the ultimate demand is for connections from data center sites. But again, I would say that optionality is really important and thinking about lots of different solutions. So, a question is there more that can be done to bridge between distribution and transmission in order to create connections? I don't know, but those are some of the questions that we would have. I think that there are also questions around flexibility that I mentioned earlier, whereby not that the flexibility is something that the grid operator or NESO effectively call, because that can be very disruptive to data center operations, but rather the customer works with flexibility providers on the customer side in order to effectively be able to be responsive and use their systems in order to be able to manage their loads in a way that ultimately is a win-win from the grid and from the data center perspective. I come back to the fact that if we can get these customers onto the system, it is a way in which you can actually lower bills as well for domestic users. And so we need to be thinking not just about the growth vector, but also how can you find that way to create that win-win and lower bills too for the domestic user.
Let me bring in Juliet and then Tony.
I think also we should be trying to push data centers on innovation. At the moment, we're kind of building them just very straightforwardly. They've just been done as they've been done before. I don't think we're seeing any real look at how do we do that level of computing? Does it need that level of energy? So sort of innovation in photonics, looking at quantum computing and where that's appropriate within the system. So at the moment, we're using a very refined, precise tool of electronics to create pictures of cats. We don't necessarily need to do that. So that there needs to be some choice, I think, and we need to push sort of the data centers in terms of what are they being used for and how they're being processed. I think also, I know that we're looking at offshore data centers as well, looking at sea cooling. So I think, again, we need to start to imagine a world where we shouldn't just be thinking of the problem today. Let's be asked about a problem tomorrow.
Yeah, I think optionality, as Sonia said, is crucial. I don't think we can hang around with this. These are real things in an economy which is, by any definition, sluggish, and we're looking for growth sectors. If we can't seize the opportunity here, then that is not a good thing for the UK. I mean, we're having multiple applications from the gas network, and I think that's where the optionality kicks in, that we need to see this as a cross-vector issue. But we can't let the grass go under our feet and say, well, we're going to kind of work out exactly what the right solution is. We've got to be seen to be reacting to that market and how it's developing. Otherwise, these people will go elsewhere and set data centers up in other geographies.
Yeah, I completely agree that if you imagine the economy of the future, then I can't see data centers, artificial intelligence technology not being part of that to drive the economy and drive growth. So it's not data centers it's data centers and about finding the ways to make it work. And just sort of circling back to the conversation we had on planning, we sort of talked about integrated state planning type things before, but actually local planning, regulations, the ability to get things built is also super important in all of these things as well.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion. I should say that the question that was posed at the end there about data centers was courtesy of Oliver Lancaster, CEO of IGEM. So thank you very much for your question, Ollie. That's it for the podcast. We are already in preparations for Utility Week Live 2027. Would you believe it? So please do look out for updates on that and your chance to join us in May of next year. Plenty of other opportunities, though, to come along to events with Utility Week. We've just launched the program for Utility Week Forum, which I'm really looking forward to hosting in November. So I would urge you to take a look at that. But that's it for our podcast for this week. Please join us again. We'll be having another podcast dropping in about a fortnight's time, where we'll be discussing everything that's going on in the energy and water sectors. But in the meantime, please do keep up to date on the website. I will speak to you again the next time. Thank you very much for listening.